Hello everybody. Here we are, session 6 of our Web Tools for Technical Writers class. Let's get right into it. Today's class is on translation and web content. So if we refer to global, global is of, relating to, or involving the entire world. The world is defined as, at least by Shakespeare, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. But of course Shakespeare got that from the rock band Rush, who said, all the world's indeed a stage, we are merely players, performers and portrayers, each other's audience outside the gilded cage. It took me all my effort to not sing that, to actually just recite that. Okay, so global reality. So we're going to talk about global, we're going to talk about translation, we're going to talk about a bunch of realities, and then we're going to talk about how we can overcome or even leverage those realities. So the global reality is that it's nearly impossible to do business in this age in just one language. And if we think about the evolution of communications, the first humans used smoke, fire, drums, petroglyphs, pictograms, ideograms, writing. And then by the 1300s, wooden blocks of movable text printing were developed in China. We had the Gutenberg creating printing presses. We had first experimental acoustic mechanical telephone. We had optical telegraph in 1700s, electrical telegraph in the 1800s. Television started to show up in the early 1900s. By the mid-1900s, we had commercial telecommunication satellites. By the late 1900s, we had the internet, mobile, satellite, handheld phones. In the 2000s, we had voice over internet protocol, smartphones, big data, Google Glass, the Internet of Things. So communication has evolved, and so have the tools. So in the beginning, we have cave paint, hammers and chisels, paint and ink, and we eventually evolved up to computers with word processors and databases, and then desktop publishing and content management systems. So the tools for communication are evolving. So where are we in the continuum? Desktop publishing tool-centric communication, while still ubiquitous, is giving way to content management systems, open standards-driven communication. So let's talk about the communication. The communication reality is that websites, emails, campaigns, manuals, brochures, data sheets, marketing, safety bulletins must be robust in this day and age. The machinery that creates these communications is elegant but complex, powerful but complicated. And what about translation? So the reality of translation is that today's elegant but complex, powerful but complicated tools are seldom optimized for translation. It's getting better, but translation is definitely still an afterthought with the tools. So the translation reality continued. Translation is tricky, error-prone, and full of challenges. Translating can be expensive, inaccurate, inconsistent, and take a long time. And at the end of the day, we've all seen some pretty crazy translations. So the global reality restated is it is nearly impossible to do business in this day and age in just one language. So in this session, we're going to talk about filling the gap. Communication reality, the tools are elegant but complex, powerful but complicated. Translation reality, tools are seldom optimized for translation. The global reality is nearly impossible to do business in this day and age in just one language. So she or he who can fill this gap will enable accurate, complete, timely information globally without breaking the bank. This is one of the soapboxes that I get on a lot. If there's one thing in this day, one thing that is difficult and is necessary to solve, its translations. So how do we do that? How do we fill the gap? We leverage localization, translation, open standards. We learn each open standard, apply that open standard with the translation workflow, and learn how tools implement that open standard. Okay, so we've talked about this in the first class, but let's reiterate. A lot of people confuse open standards versus open source. So an open standard, which is what we're talking about, is a specified instruction for achieving something that is independent of manufacturers or vendors and is available in the public domain, generally without charge. Open standards often provide a standardized way to code a solution for a task. Excuse me. Open source, on the other hand, is software. Software whose source code is made available for use or modification as users or other developers see fit. It is usually developed as a public collaboration and made freely available. Open standards are not software, tools, proprietary, or de facto. They are solutions, specifications for creating software and tools that solve a common need. Some well-known open standards include HTML, XML, DITA, USB, etc. The open standards we'll learn about in this session are, of course, XML. We've talked about that in all of our preceding classes. XML is the underlying open standard for all localization translation open standards. In other words, the localization translation open standards we'll talk about today are XML vocabularies. We already talked about that with DITA and HTML in earlier classes. The particular standards that we'll be looking at in this session are XLIFF, TMX, and TBX. But rather than just going through and calling things XLIFF, TMX, TBX, and using a bunch of acronyms, especially when it comes to localization, why don't I go ahead and give you the translation terms. LSP is Localization Service Provider. That's a company providing translation and localization services. SRX, Segmentation Rules Exchange. We're not going to talk about segmentation in this class. TBX, we are talking about. Term-Based Exchange is an XML open standard for representing and exchanging terminological data. Translation Memory, TM, is a collection of segments which can be sentences, paragraphs, or text strings that have been previously translated in order to aid human translators. Translation Memory Exchange, TMX, is an XML open standard defining the exchange of translation memory between computers, aided translation tools, and localization tools like XLIFF. XLIFF is the XML localization interchange file format. XLIFF is the translation payload. XML is an open standard. XLIFF is an XML open standard defining a lossless interchange format for translating text. And finally, XML, we've talked about that quite a bit. GILT is another acronym that's quite prevalent in the localization translation industry. So that includes globalization, which is marketing a product or company worldwide; internationalization, which is creating a product that can be marketed worldwide; localization, adapting the product to linguistic and cultural norms of the region; and translation, which is reproducing the text from the source language into the target language. GILT, G-I-L-T. So there are a number of challenges, and for the sake of articulating the value of each of the open standards, I've outlined a challenge and then a response to that challenge. This cadence will become familiar as we go forward. So, do we send the native source files directly to the translator or the localization service provider? In other words, do we send .doc files or InDesign files or whatever the native source file format is? The answer is only if you want it to cost top dollar and take a long time and have errors. Converting it to XLIFF is the solution to this challenge. Let's talk about XLIFF. XML Localization Interchange File Format, XLIFF, is an OASIS open standard. It's available at this URL here on the screen. The current version is XLIFF 2.1. Previous to that, we had XLIFF 2.0 and 1.2. Translation tools use XLIFF as the native file format. Translators know and like XLIFF. Why do we care? Translation tools open XLIFF as the native file format. In other words, like for example, Microsoft Word opens .doc or docx The computer-aided translation tools that the translators use open .xliff or .xlf. In other words, XLIFF files as the native file format. So there's no file conversion overhead, no overhead for translators to buy and learn a proprietary software. In other words, if we send them InDesign files, the translators actually have to learn how, they have to buy and learn how to use InDesign. With XLIFF, they don't have to do that. Some formats are exceedingly difficult to translate in their native format, like websites, like software, like graphics. If we extract the translatable text into XLIFF, we've solved that exceedingly difficult situation. The need to provide information to people who speak in a different language is an age-old challenge. The evolution of the translation of process over the years looked something like this. In the beginning, translations were done by brute force. Over time, successful methods became repeatable processes that could be documented and shared from one group to another. As momentum grew, these processes became ad hoc standards. The game changer, the watershed moment, occurred when we recognized that ad hoc standards must evolve into open standards. Once XLIFF and its fellow translation standards became open standards, tools, translators, content management systems, and translation customers could exchange translation workflows in a predictable way. As other XML-based open standards arrived, such as DITA, SVG, DocBook, and HTML, it became possible to automate the translation workflow using standard tools. The XLIFF Roundtrip refers to the following translation workflow. A source file in the source language, let's say for example Microsoft Word in English, is transformed, step 2, into the XLIFF format. The translated step 3 XLIFF format is translated to the target language, and then we transform the XLIFF back into the source file format. For example, Microsoft Word file, but now in Chinese. This is called the extract and merge paradigm. It's an established model for efficient translation. So let's say we start off with our source document, website, or software. We extract the localizable text and format information into a single XLIFF file. We provide that to our localization service provider. They open that XLIFF file in their translation tool, their computer-aided translation tool. They translate the text. The translated text is saved into that same XLIFF file, and now the XLIFF file becomes bilingual. We convert that back into its original format, and we now have a translated document, website, or software. So the way XLIFF does that is really just dirt simple. We isolate the translatable text into translation units. We have segments, and we have a source, and we have a target. And the idea is we translate the source, hello, into target. If we say Spanish, it would be hola. We retain the document's structure either in internal or external to the XLIFF file via a skeleton, or internally with the group elements. Very simple. So for example, let's say we have this InDesign file. It's in English. We export the English to XML. We transform the XML into XLIFF, so we have the same XML that was proprietary, but we've transformed it into XLIFF, so we have source, target, source, target, source, target. We translate, the translator opens the XLIFF file in their computer-aided translation tool. They translate each segment, and now we have, in this case, English, German, English, German, English, German. We transform that back into the proprietary XML format that InDesign likes, and then InDesign imports that, and we have the same exact format, but now it's in the translated language. The translator did not have to buy or learn InDesign. The translator opened the file in its native, in the native format in their computer-aided translation tool. They were able to leverage translation memory, use the glossary for the correct terms, and quality, speed, and economy were the outcomes. So challenge 2, we talked about XLIFF, which is the payload. What about translation memory? This thing I'm sending contains several segments that I've already translated in the past. Isn't there a way to leverage the already translated segments? Answer, yes, as long as you or your localization service provider have been saving your translation pairs in the form of TMX files. But wait, can't I just store them in a spreadsheet? Answer, using an open standard lets you transfer the translation memory from vendor to vendor and is directly accessible in the computer-aided translation tool. So let's talk about TMX. Translation memory and TMX. TMX is Translation Memory Exchange. It's an open standard for the exchange of translation memory. Translation tools use TMX to leverage and add translation memory. TMX 1.4b was passed April 2005. It included a specification and an XML DTD. Translation memory, on the other hand, is the more generic term. Translation memory enables the translation of segments, sentences, paragraphs, or phrases of a document by searching for similar segments in a collection and using suggested matches that are found. And there's this quote here from my friend Rodolfo Raya that you can look up at Max Programs, the URL at the bottom of the slide there. So the idea is, let's say we start off with DITA, and this is a particular DITA concept topic about one of my favorite topics, punk and grunge. It says Nirvana was an American band from Aberdeen in the state of Washington, and there's a sentence about the Clash and a sentence about Soundgarden. We open the XLIFF file. We start with DITA. We convert it to XLIFF. So we convert to XLIFF, and then we open it in a computer-aided translation file, tool, I mean. So then there's a good look at the XLIFF. There's one for Nirvana, one for the Clash, and one for Soundgarden. Each of them are just shown as source segments now. We add a TMX file. So we happen to have this TMX file on hand that looks like this, and we have we can see that we've already translated a sentence about the Clash into German. We've already translated a sentence about Nirvana into German, and we've translated a sentence about Soundgarden into German. So we process the translation. We use the XLIFF 2.0 module translation candidates, and then the computer-aided translation tool finds those matches and puts them in the translation candidate module for the translator to observe. If the translator agrees that this is a good translation for the source, then the translator will use that translation in the XLIFF file. They'll view the match, they'll accept the match, and then they'll not have to translate that particular match. And we, the customer, won't have to pay for it because translation memory 100% in context matches are usually not charged by the translator. Okay, so then the XLIFF file is translated. So now we have this XLIFF file that is populated, or that has been filled in this case with translation memory. We convert it back to DITA, and now we have Nirvana, Clash, and Soundgarden sentences in the exact same concept topic, but now instead of the source language of English, they are in the target language of German. So that's XLIFF and TMX. What about glossary? In my industry, there are a lot of terms that could be ambiguous to translators who are not necessarily experts in our field. Also, we want to make sure that certain terms are always translated correctly, consistent with my company's style guide. Can I send a glossary of terms to the translator to keep all of this straight? The answer is yes. Store your glossary in TBX files. Tools can read these directly, and TBX defines standardized ways to store and use metadata about the terms. And again, since it's an open standard, you can pass it from vendor to vendor, and they will understand it. So let's talk about TBX. TBX is term-based exchange. It's an open standard for representing structured terminological data. It's available at this URL. Translators use TBX to understand and disambiguate terms. Translators know and like TBX. TBX 1.0 was passed in October 2008. It comes with a specification and a DTD. So let's talk about TBX. XLIFF enables tagging of terms. So in XLIFF, we have a sentence, the MC5 album Kick Out the Jams was recorded live at, and then we have a term here, a concert. The term is concert, and it's called out by this MRK element at Detroit's Grandee Ballroom in October 1969. We can open that in our computer-aided translation tool. We can select a TBX file. In this case, we have a TBX file that says the term concert is defined as a live performance, typically of music before an audience. And it happens to have the translated term, not necessary to have that. The really important thing is that we have a term and its definition so that the translator will know that we are using this particular term in this particular manner. So then the process shows so we've matched the term, the potential term, and embedded that in the glossary module in the XLIFF file. So now in the XLIFF file we have this term that's called out by the mark element, and we've said we've matched that term in the TBX file, and then the translator can say, okay, it's a live performance, typically of music before an audience. Now I know how to translate that term. A more ambiguous example would be, suppose we have a translator who's not familiar with guitars, and there's a sentence called, the strings are strummed sometimes with a pick. Are we talking about a pick like in basketball, a mining pick, a draft pick, a dental pick, a pickpocket, somebody picking fruit? We disambiguate by saying it's a pick, which is a small, thin device of metal or plastic used to pluck a stringed instrument. Ah, the translator said, I know what that means. I'll use the appropriate term. So those are the open standards. Let's talk specifically, let's run those open standards through an example of translating DITA. We talked about this before, the paradox of DITA. Its DITA strength is all of its topics, but its difficulty is all of its topics. The strategy is to take advantage of DITA's map files and to create an XSLT that can read the map file and convert each referenced file into a single XLIFF file. So in my little cartoon, we have the translation, the technical writer who says, hey boss, let's switch to DITA. It's a component content management system. It's a great idea. The boss is mildly interested. It's nimble. That didn't really resonate with the boss. No more document-centric constraint, and the boss is kind of confused by that. It's supported by best tools and practices, and the boss is kind of not very interested, and he's off looking at his laptop. In more precise information for our customers, and the boss says, you know, I'll only be interested if this saves me money. And then the technical writer says, hey, but wait, we can save boatloads of money and boatloads of time and boatloads of money on translation. And the boss finally says, you've got my attention, let's do it. 9 months later, we look into the cost of doing the translations, and we think, wait a second, that didn't pan out the way we wanted it to. The problem is that the DITA has hundreds or even thousands of files, and they can be tedious to translate one by one. We talked about this example in a previous class. Projects can consist of hundreds, thousands, or even millions of topics. Localization service providers can process DITA topics, but that's not necessarily their core competency, and they rightfully charge extra for the overhead and the expertise. So one of the ways we can get around this is this XLIFF Roundtrip tool. This is an open source utility that I created. You can look it up at this YouTube URL to see exactly how that works. But really in practical steps, what you do is you obtain the DITA Open Toolkit. You download it. We went over this in previous classes. You download the DITA Open Toolkit. You run it at the command line. And then you can download the DITA XLIFF Roundtrip plugin for the DITA Open Toolkit, which I did include in the D2L resources. And you just follow the directions in the, oh boy, the formatting got really funny on this slide. If you care to, this isn't even an exercise that I'm asking you to do, but if you want to do it, you can do that. You follow the steps there in the instructions file that I've uploaded to D2L, and it will do exactly what we said. It will take the hundreds of topics referenced by the map file, turn it into a single XLIFF file, give you the opportunity to translate the XLIFF file, and then run the inverse in the DITA plugin that will then convert the XLIFF file into its original DITA format with maps and topics, only translated. So let's talk about another example, translating websites. Translating websites has a unique challenge. Unlike most other content types, websites do not lend themselves to simple file exchanges with translators. You have two choices. Allow the translators access to your site and have them translate on your server, and let me just tell you, that's yucky. Or export the files to an intermediary file format and have the files translated, then import them back into your website. That's less yucky, and it becomes completely unyucky if you use XLIFF as the file format. So let's go over why letting translators translate on your server is yucky. The following case study shows how a website in a popular content management system, Drupal, would be translated without XLIFF as prescribed in Drupal core. I think that they've changed this, but for the longest time Drupal core actually said what you should do is let the translators translate on your server. It just makes me shiver to think that. So the way that would work is the translator would log in, assuming they have proper permissions and access. They would click the Translate tab in Drupal. They would pick the language that they want to translate into. It's getting trickier and trickier. They would then have this interface. They would say, okay, I think I should translate the subtitle. Okay, good. I think I should translate the details title. Okay, that's good. I'm translating these into German. What's all of this? I'm confused. Unique name must mean German name. I'll translate this. What happens then? Boom! I just blew up every node of this content type. How do I know that that's what happens? I'd rather not say. And oops, I accidentally added German to the Japanese page. Dang. Well, that's what can happen when you let translators, and nothing against translators, if they really don't know how to use Drupal, they're just doing their best guesses in Drupal, and they can do some serious harm. Really, they could take down the entire website. So, what's a better way? Why don't we leverage XLIFF? So here's a use case that shows how that would work. You can download the Drupal.org XLIFF project. This is a project that somebody that I know who works at Drupal and I wrote to solve this particular problem. So the fundamental difference in this tool is that all the Drupal steps are done by a Drupal administrator, and the translator does all her or his work in a computer-aided translation tool. No boom, no blowing up the website. So the Drupal administrator logs in. They pick the XLIFF module. They select the nodes that they want to translate. In this case we're going to translate bit error rate tester. They export the nodes to XLIFF using the tool. They save the files locally. The post-processing is usually necessary. For example, translating inventory status would corrupt the Drupal database, so we apply the automated post-processing that adds the field state equals final to lock that field out of the translator's tool, so the translator cannot accidentally translate that field. The localization service provider leverages translation memory and Translate. This is a more commercial computer-aided translation tool in this particular screenshot, but you can see the English is on the left, and the source, the target translation language is German. They've leveraged translation memory, and they're translating everything. We've translated only what we desire to be translated. The 1-year warranty is translated correctly into German, but the field inventory status has been locked out and has not been translated into German. That's a good thing. So we import the XLIFF, and we have that same exact node, only it is now translated into German from the XLIFF file. And that is that. So that concludes today's class on translation and web content. Please let me know if you have any questions. Again, if you want to go over the XLIFF with the, the exercise with the Drupal XLIFF Roundtrip tool, I didn't give you a lot of instruction, but you have everything you need to do that in DITA. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and we can discuss it in our next in-class session, or you can send me email. Thank you, everybody. Bye.